We're joined by Christina Quinn, who's Director for Leadership and Management Implementation Review, NHS England, by Tracy Jolliffe, who's the Head of Inclusive Leadership and Development at NHS England, by Matthew Taylor, who's Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation, by Tricia Pereira, who's the Director of Operations Skills for Care, and by Dr. Peter Redding, who's the co-chair, the Disabled NHS Directors Network. So I'd like to welcome you all on stage. Let me know when it's just some water as well. Right. I think the idea is that each of you will speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion, and then we'll take questions from the auditorium. So Christina first.
Lovely to see you all. And I'm the warm-up act, giving a overview and a little bit of insight around the Messenger Review, or to give it its full title, which I think is really important, Leadership for a Collaborative and Inclusive Future. And I anticipate, and it's not very often I say this about big reviews, that you will have all read it, because it is an absolutely beautifully written and crafted review. And I don't know about you, but it really spoke very personally to me around some of the things, some of the challenges, some of the huge opportunities that we have in the space of inclusive leadership and management and for our future. And you'll be aware that it was published in June, and it focused on the strengths. This was a really important thing to say to you all around strengths-based reviews, and the key interfaces with our colleagues in social care, which is the most important thing, especially as we are really moving and motoring with our integrated care systems and understanding what that alignment really means for us in terms of leaders and managers. And you'll know it identified 7 recommendations, which I'll just share with you now, specifically the 7 recommendations that you can see here now. And I just want to say a couple of things about those recommendations. One of the key things that Sir Gordon and Dame Linda found as they were talking, and they spoke to an awful lot of people, in fact they may have spoken to some of you guys in the room as well, is there is excellent best practice out there. And as part of the implementation, our role is to highlight that best practice, is to look at where we've got best practice and where we can see that best practice in action through ourselves and through our people and through our teams. But what they also identified, and this is the thing that we need to be concerned about as NHS leaders, is that was patchy. Is it wasn't the same for everybody. It wasn't the same for everybody in the organisations, in the systems, in the teams, and the people that they spoke to spoke about that quite candidly with them. And I invite you to ask yourselves, where you've got best practice, is that fair? Is that equitable? Is that experience shared by all in your organisations? And really seek out the people who tell you that it's not, and ask them the reasons why and why not there. And here are some of the things that people told through the review. And the most important thing is around the patient is first in everything. The patient, the citizen, the business of caring, the compassion, the kindness. But there were also elements in the review there around that it's not fair and that not everybody have access. That this work really leads to better outcomes, better patient care, better workforce experience, retention, all the things that we know that really great leadership and management involves. And I think probably as we all sit, and I stand here as well, we'll all have personal experiences of this. This isn't something that's done in a dark room. Being a leader and a manager is hard, isn't it? And at the moment, it's really tough. And it's really tough to be very focused on values and outcomes and behaviours based on equality, diversity and inclusion, but it's essential. And in the review candidly states it is the only way to improve services is through that lens. I just want to share with you, this slide looks a bit busy. I hope you can see it clearer on your screen than mine, but to show and to demonstrate and to offer you that all the recommendations are singular in their approach, but are absolutely joined together, starting with induction and recommendation 1, and recommendation 7 is about getting the best talent into the most challenged systems. They are all connected, they are all interconnected there. And I think it's fair to say the implementation team do not stand and sit here thinking we're going to tell you what and how to do. We most definitely aren't. We're going to support the identification of frameworks and best practice so that you can apply what you already have in the system, what you already see going on, and the fantastic work going on in your organisations. One piece of work we've already started, and most of you will have completed something for us for this, is looking at a stock take about what's happening in your organisations and your systems already. And there are literally hundreds and hundreds of things that are going on. So the real internal and interesting question is, with everything that you're doing, where and at what points does it make the difference to the staff? Where and at what points does it unleash the ability for the experiences, the good experiences, to be shared for and by all the workforce? Yeah, and I've got one final thing to share with you. It's all it's personal, this, isn't it? It's always personal. Our work about leadership and management is always personal. And I promised myself every opportunity I get, I'll talk about Colin. And Colin is my brother-in-law, my brother. And he was beautifully cared for by University College Hospital, London, and you can see him there. I've known Colin since he was 14, so he's more than a brother-in-law, he's a brother. And you can see him there with my sister and family and 3 boys. And Colin died 18 months ago of lymphoma that he had, well, in his mind, he had a very successful bone marrow transplant because it gave him an extra year with his family. So leadership and management and our business isn't just about a policy and a document and a piece of paper. We live and breathe it, don't we? And we live and breathe it for the millions of Collins out there and the millions of our staff. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Tracy. Over to you, Tracy. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Great. I'm Tracy, Head of Inclusive System Development for NHS England. I was part of the messenger review that Christina was talking about, and I was in that team and experienced the empowering leadership of General Sir Gordon Messenger and Dame Linda Pollard, and the ways in which diverse voices were both listened to and positively responded to. One of the outcomes of creating such a climate was that the messenger review centred equality, diversity and inclusion. That was no coincidence. So I'm going to talk about racial equity, a subject that is core to us making the improvements in the NHS, retaining staff, attracting a new and motivated workforce to the NHS. And I'm going to speak about building inclusive leadership capabilities that relate to racial justice and equitable practices across health and care. The pace of change towards justice in the workforce has been painfully slow. This journey is often thwarted by unexamined thinking, expectations and standards that are too low, and outdated leadership practices that are unlikely to bear the anticipated fruit of racial justice and social justice. because the seeds of the values of the NHS Constitution only germinate with the fertile soil of inclusive leadership practice. We'll deliver the Messenger Review Recommendation 2 that relates to EDI if we purposefully set out to locate and then to part company with those outdated thinking and practices that we have in this space, replacing these with practices and actions that lead to racial justice for the health and care workforce, for patients and for communities. Historic approaches to leadership development haven't adequately built the kinds of knowledge and capabilities that will dismantle systemic racial injustice. In order to do this, I'm going to propose 3 essential practice shifts. Of course, there are more. And these shifts and others have been incorporated into the NHS England's leadership development offer called the Building Leadership for Inclusion Initiative that targets NHS trust boards and ICBs. So going on to the practice shifts. Practice shift 1. Creating racial justice initiatives must centre the experiences of those who are targeted by racism and use those lived experiences as the most important and credible barometer of progress. When racial justice efforts don't improve the experiences of those who are racially minoritized, leaders can learn from this and make adjustments that improves their effectiveness. This requires leaders at all levels to continually test their anti-racist practices for their impact. It's not enough to speak about values. The work has to make a difference to those we claim to be doing this work in service of. So how are we going to measure for these more subtle experiential shifts that tell us that we're online going forward? Practice shift 2. What does equipping and building anti-racist capabilities in our leaders look like? 5 points. Leaders who understand how systemic racism works and can detect and address racism in its most subtle forms. Leaders who are equipped with appropriate language and anti-racist lexicon and can use that language as an effective tool for change. Leaders who are skilled at having conversations across racial difference about racism in the workplace. Leaders who can do the work on themselves, growing the emotional capacity to stay the course towards racial justice in the face of resistance. And leaders who commit to working on their own internalized racial biases whilst modeling and supporting the growth of effective anti-racist practices in others. Practice shift 3. We need to practically acknowledge the fact that racism causes harm, and therefore people require time and space to heal. Staff who endure discrimination often feel overwhelmed or experience trauma, but they look and find little support available for them for their healing. These are conversations that staff understandably are reluctant to talk about openly. Trauma-informed leadership practices are required for workplace cultures to promote health and well-being for all of their staff. So in closing, racial equity is only ever intersectional. Initiatives for change need to start from that space. No social problem is ever solved if we're not talking about it. Creating cultures with racial equity, in which racial equity is the expectation, is within the gift of health and care leaders. That's all of us. But we'll need to be brave. In the words of Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley, we have the capacity to choose differently. So let's choose differently. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy.
Well, the very least I can do is be quick, so that there's time for us to have a conversation. So this agenda is very central to the work of the Confederation, our EDI team under Joan Sadler, the fact that we proudly host the Race and Health Observatory, the work of NHS employers. One of the first things that I did when I came to the Confed was develop a set of impact goals, and one of those impact goals was specifically focused on our commitment to support NHS leaders in tackling health inequalities. So in my incredibly brief comments, I want to use the framework that we'll be using in our new anti-racism strategy that we'll be publishing next week. And that framework is around kind of three ideas: understanding, commitment, and action. So understanding means that we need to understand not only the manifestation of exclusion and inequality by looking at the data, listening to lived experience, of understanding what drives that. That's why I commend, for example, the work of the Race and Health Observatory, which is often about trying to understand why it is that we have unequal outcomes. And I also think part of that understanding is about a willingness to have difficult conversations around challenging issues. So understanding is do we really know what is going on in our organisations? Do we really know what's going on in relation to staff, in relation to health inequalities? By the way, I'm putting together the challenge of EDI in relation to employment and our commitment to tackling health inequalities, because I actually think those two agendas have a lot of synergy. We need to think about them together. So understanding is the first. Then commitment, and for me, commitment is around seeing EDI as being integral to our model of change. It is integral to the idea of getting the most out of our colleagues, to how we recruit, how we retain, how we motivate. It's not an addition to that strategy, it's at the core of that strategy. And equally, it is an essential part of how we meet the health needs of our population. In essence, what I mean by commitment is that this is just the way we do things. It's not something we do at the margins, it's not something we do occasionally. It is simply the way in which we act as a good employer, and it is simply the way in which we act in terms of meeting population health needs. And then thirdly, action, because understanding and commitment is fine, but in the end it has to turn into action. And until the golden day when there is no evidence of exclusion, we need, it seems to me, to do three things consistently. We need to demonstrate that in all our work we are sensitive to issues of exclusion and discrimination. So that is part of how we look at every challenge, whether it's kind of reconfiguring services or innovation. How do we look at that through an EDI lens? That's the first part. The second is, are we taking specific initiatives to tackle specific challenges? So because we've got that understanding, what are the concrete issues and what are we concretely doing to address particular forms of exclusion, particular challenges that we have? And I think if we don't have an agenda, if we can't say, look, here's a specific challenge we identified and here's a specific program that's seeking to do something about that, then there's something missing in terms of action. And then finally, how do we remain vigilant to new challenges and new opportunities? And I think the most obvious recent one has been the cost of living crisis. And I would commend, it seems to me, if you look at the NHS Employers website, you'll see this fantastic work that you have undertaken to support your staff, and particularly more disadvantaged staff, more challenged staff in terms of socioeconomic circumstances, in terms of the cost of living crisis. And, you know, there are limits to what we can do because of the overall pay situation, but incredible imagination that has been undertaken by you as leaders, addressing what you see in terms of that cost of living crisis for your staff and also for your patients. So, you know, this is an unfolding agenda, but, you know, actually overall I would say, you know, as someone who's come into the service from the outside just 18 months ago, I am impressed by how deep the commitment to this is, but we just have to see it as part of business as usual. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Tricia. Oopsie.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Tricia Pereira, Director of Operations at Skills for Care. More recently, I was Head of Adult Social Care in a local authority in the London Borough. And I'm also a member of the Messenger Implementation Group. So I just wanted to also start with some data around the workforce. But as we know, research shows that inclusive cultures free from discrimination Places where people feel that they belong and feel supported can lead to improved organisational effectiveness, and my colleagues have covered some of that already. And this is why we welcome being part of the Messenger Review into leadership and the need to embed inclusive leadership practice and promote the values of equity, equality, diversity and anti-racism in leadership. And as I said, I just wanted to share a bit of data around the social care workforce and the demographics. So there are 1.5 million people working in social care, and people from ethnic minority communities account for 1 in 5 of the adult social care workforce in England, and we play a vital role in the day-to-day care of people in our communities. So in 21-22, the workforce was more diverse than the population of England. And we know that workers from Black, African, Caribbean, Black British background accounted for over half of the Black, Asian and minority ethnic adult social care workforce. Regionally, there are large variations, with London having the most diverse workforce at 68%, and the North East the least diverse workforce at 5%. In general, these proportions reflect the population in each area. And this information, it includes workforce data for local authorities and the independent sector only at this stage. So the proportion of workers with a Black, Asian or ethnic minority background has increased slowly over the period, from 20% of all workers in 2012-2013 to 23% in 21-22, and 12% of all managerial roles in 2012 to 16% currently. And with the ongoing trend in international recruitment, this will continue to grow. So, however, there are differences in diversity between job roles. Notably, there are proportionally more males and more white people in senior roles. The root cause of this difference can't be ascertained from the workforce data alone. However, it's a concern because it indicates, or it could indicate, a lack of equal opportunity or discrimination in the sector. As a social worker, that's my professional background, anti-racist, anti-oppressive, anti-discriminatory practice, that's all inherent to my ethical value base and our code of practice. However, this concept is often applied when referring to delivery of services and supporting people who draw on care and support, and at times not really applied to the colleagues, to the workforce, to people that we work alongside. And we cannot continue to allow these concepts to be hollow words. But over the last couple of years, many employers and organisations have been reflecting and acknowledging on how to address systemic racism and how to be actively anti-racist, recognising that simply not being racist is not enough. I have seen this particular framework being used by a variety of organisations. And it's helping them to think about where they currently are and to reflect on their workforce demographics and who occupies the senior roles. And it's helping them to tackle the internal processes, systems and structures that perpetuate systemic racism, supporting the underpinning work to be actively anti-racist. Of course, this is an ongoing journey, and the aim is to reach the growth zone and consistently remain in that area. And much of the work takes place in the learning zone. So educating ourselves around the experiences of workers and having to have those so-called uncomfortable or clumsy conversations. You owe it to your workforce to put the work in, to do the learning, to make the effort, to make a difference. As we know, the Messenger Review calls for EDI to have a more central role in leadership training and for a set of uniform standards for equal opportunities and fairness across health and social care, at entry level and at mid-career level. And also the recent white paper, the social care white paper, has also identified EDI as a priority area. But it takes more than policy. It takes a real authentic commitment to change behaviours. And as the Secretary of State said earlier, it's far better to show, not tell. And at Skills for Care, we're developing and promoting tools and resources to help employers implement inclusive and positive organisational structures, including in partnership with the Department of Health, developing and rolling out the social care workforce race equality standards. and the development of competencies and behaviours which will allow us to monitor, progress and drive up standards of practice from across the sector. So promoting diverse leadership and supporting managers with adopting a compassionate leadership approach with the culture that encourages well-being and progression, and that's key to building a safe and supportive workplace culture. So over the years, we've had our Moving Up programme, and that's grown in popularity. And we've also developed the Forefront programme, and that's a pre-course programme to Moving Up, and that supports diverse leadership development. But it's not just for managers, it's aimed at people who are working in direct caregiving roles or on the forefront or who are at the start of their leadership journeys. So we're trying to establish that transformational change within people's career pathways. But this is just one element of the work that we're doing at Skills for Care to support the diverse workforce in social care and those aspiring into leadership roles. We have the new directors programme, the alumni networks, because we know that people who occupy those senior leadership roles are often just one or one of two within the organisations. So how can we support them to thrive and grow and not just survive in those roles? And as leaders, our offer supports you to understand not only your place in the system, but how you can influence and shape the workplace cultures. So inclusive leaders embark on a lifelong journey of self-discovery. It's not just the theoretical concepts. You actually have to put these into practice. They have to be felt and understood within each of the organisation. And as leaders, you must understand your own biases and assumptions that shape decision-making. So we need to support leaders to see the world through an inclusive lens, to really have that understanding of their self and to have a real commitment to equity and inclusion, and to stand up as advocates and allies to people who are facing discrimination on a day-to-day basis, not to be just a bystander. And we've recruited our head of leadership, Christine Wint, if you can just raise your hand, Christine, show where you are. Thank you. Who's going to help us really progress this work. So as leaders in the room today, we are in a unique position to make a difference to hundreds of employees and hundreds of people who access our support and our care and our services. This really is a human rights movement, a social justice movement, and I can't wait at the Q&A session, I can't wait to hear from you the difference that you're wanting to make and the steps that you are taking. These are some of the areas of inclusive leadership practice that Tracy has covered. So I didn't want to go over those because, Tracy, you said them so well, so eloquently. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tricia. And Peter.
Right, good morning, everyone. As I hope some of you know, today's the first day of Disability History Month 2022, so I hope a few of you will be wearing your purple ribbons during this month and celebrating particularly on World Day of Disability, which is 3rd of December. Get those purple flags up in your trusts. So I'm going to start off, because it is a History Month, with a reflection on the past, and we'll start off with an apology that these are all white men. We could discuss that later. But they were also very successful war leaders, and they were also, as you all know, seriously disabled. You all know about Nelson having only one eye, one arm. You all know about Churchill's black dog, his serious depression. And you all know about the polio, which left Roosevelt in a wheelchair, but didn't stop him being a great peacetime and wartime leader. So I stand before you as the co-chair of the Disabled NHS Directors Network. Some of our members in the audience, we were formed 2 years ago. We now have about 50 members. We're the first national network for people with disabilities in the NHS. We, at the moment, are only open to board members because that allows us to punch at a particular level. But we do include a very wide range of disabilities, ranging from autism through visual, hearing, mobility, mental health, long-term conditions, and other impairments as well. And we also have a very good range of ethnicity, gender, and geographical coverage. Can I talk to you, though, a little bit about some rather alarming statistics about disability in the NHS? And most of these come from a report which I hope all of your boards have discussed. which is the Workforce Disability Equality Standard Report, which you all have to contribute to, and obviously there is a national report. So 20% of the working age population of the UK have a report that they have a disability. In the NHS, only 3.7% of board members report they have a disability. And then when you probe into what goes on in trusts, nearly 2/3 of trusts have no disabled board members. 20% of the NHS workforce, when they're able to report whether they're disabled or not anonymously in the staff survey, identify as disabled. When they have to report and put their name to it, to their employer, on ESR, 3.7%. That number's creeping up, and there's huge variation between trusts. And I hope, when you go back to the ranch, you'll find out what your figure is in your trust, and whether you need to do something very actively about it. Now, I recognise there are all sorts of statistical differences here, in terms of staff survey not being 100%, etc., etc. So we're not comparing exactly like for like, but a 6-to-1 ratio makes you think. Why do our staff, and if these figures are right, we're talking 200,000 NHS staff, fear to identify to their employers that they're disabled? I leave that thought with you. You may want to look at it in your own organisation. And a lot of this, I have to say, is not about people like me who've been disabled since I was 5 months old, coming in, always being disabled as they build their careers. Recognise that 80% of disabled people become disabled during their working life. So this is about supporting people to continue careers. And that's why that statistic at the bottom about putting people into the capability process is also something you need to think about. Let's be more positive. This is about inclusion, but it's also about celebrating what difference and diversity can bring to the NHS in leadership. With respect to disability, disabled leaders bring lived experience. And if there's any organisation in Europe which needs lived experience at the top more, please tell me about it. Because remember, and these are WDES figures, 70% of the patient activity of the NHS is actually supporting disabled patients. It depends on how you calculate it. We need more disabled leaders to strengthen the voice of disabled patients in NHS decision-making. This is really important. That's our day job, looking after disabled people. So we need disabled leaders with lived experience. But it'll also encourage our workforce to value difference. And having disabled role models through the organisation matters in terms of people feeling confident about coming out as disabled. But also, as we move to a world of collaboration, diversity generally, intersectional diversity, is something we should relish more than ever, because diversity brings different opinions, it brings different thoughts. Diverse leaderships are better at collaboration. There's a business case too. 20% of the workforce are disabled. Well, if you don't tap into those, you're missing out on a lot of high-quality applicants. And then there's a final thing. Being disabled is a great management training scheme. If you're disabled, almost every moment of every day, in one respect or another, you're having to tackle problems which are associated with your disability. You have to find efficient ways of dealing with them. This isn't about being courageous or brave or anything like that. It's just being practical. What a great training scheme to be an NHS leader. And finally, I just want to leave you with a thought. And I don't totally buy into this myself. I buy into it partly. The social model of disability recognises that people are disabled by the attitudes of society rather than by their impairments. Now, there's a limit to that. I'd be pretty useless as a porter or an acute ward nurse or running for a crash trolley. But I can do other jobs in the NHS, and I have done for a rather long time. And the NHS, I have to say, does need to think about what is the dominant paradigm in its organisation. All too often, as employers, and this comes out of HR and occupational health departments and out of managerial cultures, it's prove to us that you can do, or for those 80% who develop disabilities during their careers, continue to do the job. We need to reverse that. It should be, how can we enable you to have or continue to have a great career in the NHS with us? And I have to say, in my own organisation, this week, I've seen two completely opposite examples. One, absolutely wonderful, supporting someone who's lost their sight during their time with us, who actually has got promoted and is developing her career even further. And we celebrated her in our Monday morning blog this week because it's Disability History Month. Then we have an autistic member of staff who HR are saying, thank goodness, he's resigned. Well, actually, I've asked them to reverse that and look at it again, because we should not be celebrating when particularly people with hidden disabilities, particularly autism, neurodiversity and mental health issues, leave the organisation. All too often we do that. It takes away a management problem. Should we be looking harder at how we can support them? And perhaps we can discuss that later. Finally, DNDN. If you're a board member who identifies publicly or privately as disabled, come and join us. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Before I go to audience questions, there's one kind of key thing, and I'll start with you, Peter, on this, because you raised it so beautifully when you talked about the whole way the NHS needs to reverse the way it thinks about inclusion, particularly on issues of disability, is what specific work do all of you see being done to address underrepresentation at senior levels in the NHS? Do you want to take that first?
Yes, I mean, with respect to disability, but I think there are lots and lots of examples with respect to race or gender or LGBTQ plus staff. With respect to disability, it's actually making the organisation visibly disabled friendly. And that's not just putting a disability confident logo on the bottom of your stationery. That's a pretty meaningless symbol, to be honest, if you examine it. The threshold for achieving it is pathetic. What you should be doing is looking at, do you have a disability leave policy? And there are some really good examples around the NHS, Mersey Care, Notts Healthcare. I'm working through that in my own trust at the moment to get a really good one, but some trusts are allowing 5 days. What do you do about reasonable adjustments? Do you have a central budget to support reasonable adjustments for physical changes? And do you also have access to a database for example, assisted software and so on? And finally, what are you doing around reasonable adjustments in terms of thinking, how do you support your own teams to look after and keep someone with a hidden disability, particularly autism or mental health issues? And that's the tricky one. These things play out at local level in a team of medical secretaries or a ward or whatever. It's all very well people like me at the top saying, do this, do that. But actually the people have to work with, support and nurture, and the individuals who may be struggling with their health or their disabilities are at a local level. They often don't have the skills or the training and so on. So think about those three things.
Thank you. Tricia next. So I'm quickly interested in what you see being done to include people at senior level.
As I was saying, it's not just supporting people to access learning, development and training. It's being influenced the workplace cultures of the organisation as well. So as Peter was talking about, I was just reflecting and saying, if the culture in the organisation is one, as leaders, you're truly modelling the inclusiveness so that people can feel that they belong, they feel supported, and they're able to speak and talk out and they're listened and heard from, then that makes a wealth of difference. It also that enhances the reputation of the organisation as well, and people will be attracted to take up roles and to take positions, because not only will they see the diversity in senior leadership roles, so then they can aspire into those roles if they see people at that level, but also they know that they will feel welcomed to join those organisations as well.
Tracy and then Christina and then Matthew.
You've just taken the words out of my mouth. I think that the one thing that I will say is, in order to improve representation, this is leadership behaviours. The responsibility is on our leaders, that's all of us in this room. And if we are not challenging ourselves, scrutinising our own decision making, putting into practice new ways of thinking, talking to our staff and learning from them, we will not create the cultures that will be sustainable and increase representation at a senior level. It's down to us.
Thank you, Christine.
And I think there's something about this, we have to get into the really uncomfortable nature about some of the experiences and lack of opportunities of our staff and our workforce. And it isn't, and we know it, don't we? All the things that we're hearing today and for some time aren't new. So what's the block? What's stopping? What's the action that needs to be taken? And of course, the messenger review, beautifully crafted, very insightful, details that. But what are the really difficult, uncomfortable conversations? We need to get behind all the plans and the metrics and not only see the change in behaviour, but just see the change in the paradigm, like you're saying, Peter, and the makeup of our workforce. And that's about really hearing those very, very difficult stories that are present in our organisations today. It's about having those really uncomfortable moments, as well as celebrating the highlights of where we can see it really working.
Thank you, Matthew.
I'll just make one simple point in terms of time, which is, I think as leaders, and I say this as someone who leads an organisation myself, I think a question we might want to ask ourselves is, if we were to ask our colleagues what they saw as being priorities for us as leaders, would they identify equality, diversity and inclusion as one of the priorities of us as leaders? And if I ask that question of myself, I think the answer probably is not as, I wouldn't be sure, to put it that way, which means there's a lot more work for me to do within my own organisation. So I just give you that as a simple kind of measure as a leader. If your colleagues were asked what your priorities were, would they include EDI as something which they associate you with? I think that's an interesting question for us to reflect on.
So one thing I'll follow up with, and I'll start with you, Matthew, on this is, as a journalist, I get approached a lot by people within the NHS with their negative experiences. And the number of times over the years I have met people who hold senior roles, often clinical roles, describing to me the racism they've experienced or different kinds of sexism, different kinds of discrimination. It depresses me so much. And what I hear again and again is that within the system there is a hierarchy, that there are unspoken rules, that you can get so far and not beyond. And I'm fascinated for your opinions on, despite all these great examples you've given and ideas about how we can make it work better, why I don't anecdotally still see that in reality translating better for people within the NHS who should be holding senior leadership roles from different backgrounds and diversities. Do you want to take that one first, Matthew? Especially someone just coming from outside, what do you see?
I think I'd connect it to a broader cultural challenge for the NHS that I observe as someone who's still just a little tiny bit of an
And dare I say, the fact that you hold the role you do, come from outside, I think that in itself is quite interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think what I'd observe about the culture of the NHS, it reflects the conversation I had with someone the other day who's been doing some work we're doing in the Confed around system leadership. And they reflected a conversation they'd had with a group of system leaders when they kind of said, what kind of leadership do you want to offer? And they said, well, leadership that's empowering and that's facilitative and enabling. Great. And then the next question was, what will you do if something goes wrong? And the problem was that when something goes wrong, we immediately reach for a kind of command and control kind of mentality. Now, the problem about the NHS is there's always something going wrong. That's just the nature of the fact that we've got an incredibly challenging job, and, it ain't going to become any less challenging in the immediate future. So I think one of the challenges is that we have a set of values for the good times, and too often we kind of set those aside when it feels as though we're under pressure. We're always under pressure. When things are going wrong, things are always going wrong. When we've got other priorities, there are always other priorities. So that is the step I think we have to make, which is to genuinely believe that those values are the values we use to respond to pressure, to respond to crisis, to deal with things going wrong. And I think that's the step that is really hard for leaders to take, because it requires a deep belief that those behaviours are the best way to solve problems.
No, well said, especially because of the whistleblowing aspect that I often notice when people have tried to challenge something. Did you want to go next?
I agree with everything that's been said, but just to emphasise, values really matter in this. But remember, there's the business case. And that's where I think you can sort of stop slipping back by remembering the business case around EDI. in terms of making the organisation work better, tapping into greater talent and so on. So long as you can keep that, then the risk of slipping back, I agree with you about those sort of, the instinctive slip back to command and control, but I think you've got more protection if you remember that there is a business case.
Yeah, I will say that, I mean, every woman on this panel knows there's how many decades of women in business being saying the business case for women in leadership. We wouldn't have had the 2008 crash if we'd had more women on Wall Street, but, you know, I'm fascinated by how the business case is never that important. And I'd be really interested to see if the NHS can finally kind of add that to it too. Who wants to go next?
I think for me,
go ahead,
there
Tracy.
is something about what is the history that got us to here. And historically, we have had too lower standards. I think I alluded to it when I was talking. We haven't had standards that we've held our leaders to on EDI. We need to raise those standards, and then we need to hold leaders to account for making progress on EDI year on year. It needs to be a performance measure, and when leaders fail to be able to meet those performance measures consistently, we need to do something about that. Because we talk about EDI as though it is, well, it is an improvement tool. It's an improvement tool, but we behave as though it's a nice to have. And I think that inconsistency, we just need to join those dots and hold our leaders to account, because a 2-year-old boy, Awab Ishak, died. He died because of poverty and mould. This is in Britain today. That's not acceptable. And when our leaders are not in touch with the realities on the ground in terms of the communities that they're serving, when our ICSs are detached from that kind of lived experience of real people just trying to make a living day by day, things go drastically wrong. So I think there is something about each leader having a responsibility to do their own learning, equipping themselves, and then the system creating standards and measures and holding people to account for those standards and measures.
Well said. I was thinking of that little boy's mother saying yesterday that if, you know, they hadn't been from the community they were from an African background.
Absolutely.
They might have been listened to.
Absolutely.
Christina, did you want to add something?
Yeah,
go ahead,
thank you. There's a piece of work that's quite old now by a lady called Margaret Heffernan around willful blindness. And it talks about hope over reality. So we're hopeful that things will change. And actually it was around the Enron disaster where it was very, very clear that there was a catastrophe waiting to happen. But the board and the metrics and the measures were hopeful. You know, they were hopeful. They only wanted to hear that it was going to be okay. And in some ways, it's very, very instructive for where we are now around really this isn't just about a hopeful scenario, a hopeful situation. The link between the outcomes for our patients and citizens and an inclusive leadership culture are beyond reproach. They're there for many years, for many decades. So it's about how we use the regulatory system to support and hold people to account. How we all support each other, because an inclusive culture isn't just a workplace culture, this is a life culture, and hence some of the reasons why I wanted to show my brother-in-law Colin is you don't step into work and step out of work. This is a way of behaving and being sustained, painful, hard graft, hard work with outcomes. And just finally, when I talk to colleagues, the same colleagues that you have mentioned about glass ceilings, and if you think about the nursing workforce, it's particularly prevalent there as well, is they say to me, stop asking me what I am going to do about it. Yeah. So we put people on fabulous programs, and I can think of some fantastic programs that you've cited. Is what are you going to do about it? How are we going to have the mechanism so that we move the centre of the issue from the individual to the organisation and the system?
Did you want to add anything to that?
Everything that has been said, I'm not sure what I could add, but it is around accountability, it is around values, and it's at the time that we are recruiting leaders into those roles. Are we recruiting people with the right values? At the end of the day, we are in we're in the business of supporting people. This is occupations it's relationship-based practice. So at the heart of it has to remain working with individuals, supporting individuals, having that kindness, compassionate leadership, and that will then should be modelled out because the outcomes would be better for people who are using our care and support and services.
Can we take questions? We've got time for a couple from the audience. So if we could, I don't need to raise the lights a little. Do we have our roving microphones? Yes, I can see. Was that a number 2 over there? Yes, there's definitely one down here. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Nick Catuno. I'm a correspondent at the Health Service Journal. Just to pick up on what Tracy just said about raising standards on EDI, what standards do you think specifically should be raised to make sure that EDI is not a nice to have, as you mentioned? Is there anything that stands out that NHSE or the NHS in general should be looking at to raise as a performance measure to ensure that EDI is not this nice to have? Thanks.
Thank you. Tracy,
So this is a gap, I think, that we can fill. And when we were on the Messenger Review team, and I know Christina and I have talked about this extensively, that it's the innovation that's required in an area of work that we haven't really had a lot of innovation in for years. George Floyd was a real wake-up call, I think, for the world and for the country. And because the conversations are so far behind the practice that is needed to change and transform our systems, what we first of all need to do is to understand what the issues are. So part of this is about going right back to the recruitment. What are we recruiting on the basis of? Are we properly testing people coming into the system and having a standard that says, you need to be able to demonstrate that you understand this issue, you have worked in this issue, you are creating change in this issue before you get in the door. That's one standard. Then there's something about what happens with people in professions, and with each profession, we need to have professional standards around EDI in terms of what we expect of our workforce and of our leaders in that space. And I think that this is the area of work that we need to grow, and then we need to test with all of you, because you're the people who have to make this work, and when we test it, we can be in this together and work towards closing those gaps on health inequalities, not just for our communities, but for people in the workforce. People in the workforce are our communities, and we need to pay attention to what's happening to their health in the workforce just as much as people out there, because if we're making people ill, we're making work for the NHS, and we really don't need that right now.
Any other thoughts on this, the panel? Let's go to one more question. Matthew.
Just say very briefly that when I speak to ICS leaders, I see deep commitment.
Absolutely.
And there's been a real shift in relation to population health and tackling health inequalities. And listening to the Secretary of State this morning outlining what sounded to me like an attempt to move to a situation where we have a smaller number of key outcomes for systems and then a greater devolution to systems. Yes. That is, I think, a framework that it could be powerful in this relation. So we need very clear set of outcomes. We need very public data so that systems that are not succeeding can see that they're not succeeding, can be held to account. But then we need to allow, I think, as much diversity of practice and learning, because the challenges of inclusion vary enormously from place to place. So we want to create a kind of ferment of innovation and exploration and research, where there's an enormous amount of learning taking place.
Absolutely.
But then we've got to be held to account for the fact that ultimately, year by year, we are closing those health inequalities. And as I say, as the organisation that represent ICSs, I think systems would absolutely welcome that kind of framework.
Peter.
Yeah, I'm very encouraged by the CQC stepping up its focus on EDI, and my network had a very good meeting with Ian Trenholm, the Chief Executive of CQC, only last month, and there's a real focus on that. So NHS leaders, speaking as a jobbing chief exec, we respond to targets from the centre. We also respond to what the CQC is going to come in and ask and look at and publish. So I think the CQC has a really important role in this. So I just play them in.
Fine. And final thoughts, Christina and she wanted to add anything.
Yeah, the Messenger Review found some examples of really superb practice, and where EDI and inclusion in some ways isn't a separate. It isn't something that's it isn't an add-on. It isn't a separate. It's an integrated. It's a way of how we work around here, how we do things around here, and through the stocktake, actually, every single ICS has a level of equality, diversity, inclusion, leadership and development, training and education. So I believe you're right. The opportunity there for the ICS is huge in this regard, the potential to coalesce all the great work that you're doing, but also to shine a light where it's not going as well, or where people's lived experiences are different from where we think it's going well. I think the integrated system is a really great opportunity to accelerate, because there are some great practices out there. Again, I go back to the review and the centre of the review around a strengths-based great practice, but it is patchy, and how to eliminate that.
And Tricia, finally to you.
And just to follow that through, for me, again, it's about the behaviours. It's about having those authentic behaviours that we are, as leaders, we feel confident and comfortable demonstrating and sharing, because if we are behaving in a certain way, that should be modelled and rippled throughout the organisations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. I thought even in the limited amount of time we had, I thought we really touched something quite important at the heart of this, because we talk about diversity all the time, but the reality of the difference between the talk and it being embedded in the NHS and why it matters has been really valuable. Thank you all.